Well, hello there and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at 4 ways in which Christians have related the theory of evolution to the biblical evidence. Now, as we begin, it would be helpful to review our doctrine of creation. A Christian doctrine of creation states that creation is that free act of God whereby God, according to God's sovereign will and for God's own glory, in the beginning brought forth the whole visible and invisible universe without the use of pre-existent material, and thus gave it an existence distinct from his own and yet always dependent on him. Now what we'll see is that all 4 of the positions that we talk about today are Christian positions because they all fit into this definition. All of them affirm that creation is wholly and completely and entirely an act of God, according to his sovereign will and for his own glory, that it is creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, that is God's creative act, and that creation remains always fully dependent on God for its continuation and for its final end. Where these positions will differ is in how God created, by what means creation is accomplished, and we'll see that these different theories remain, of course, in this Christian position. Here are the 4 theories that we'll be discussing today. First of all is what's called the young earth position. Now, there are a number of Christians today who hold this position, that is that the earth is between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. Basically, what they do is they read the creation stories as a scientific account, and they read the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5 as a historical record without any gaps in it, and they come up with the idea that the earth must be between somewhere 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Now, if that's the case, then evolutionary theory, they say, must absolutely be wrong. And so we'll look at this view and see what the evidence is. A second position is that of the old earth. That is, that the earth is much older, and so the creation stories are kind of a scientific account or kind of a historical account, but they're more general. These days are not literal 24-hour days, but are longer time periods. Perhaps there was a gap between Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and Genesis 1:2, now this is the account of how God created, or there's possibly other positions there as well. Now, in my understanding, the old earth position and the position of intelligent design theory have in the last 10 years or so, basically become the same position. I don't see much difference between them. For the purpose of this class, we won't distinguish between them. Both are making the same claim, that is that, of course, God created the heavens and the earth ex nihilo, and the Genesis accounts give us something of a general understanding of how God went about doing that, but that this allows evolutionary theory to have some merit and to fit in with the biblical texts. They can be conformed with evolutionary theory in some way. Now, the third perspective, what's known as the 4th perspective here, is that of theistic evolution. Theistic evolution is fully compatible with options 2 and 3, of course. Their emphasis is a little different. That is, that the creation stories aren't really intending at all to make a scientific claim about how God created. They would say that would have been a foreign idea to the earliest readers of these texts. It's therefore an odd thing to impose on them a scientific reading. These texts aren't telling us anything scientifically about how God created. They're giving us a theological point about why God created. And the emphasis here then is that evolutionary theory gives us a scientific picture that's very useful for us. It's the most useful scientific model, and that there's nothing incompatible then between that and the creation stories because they're each doing a different thing. All 4 of these positions are certainly Christian positions on the doctrine of creation that we just read, and so all of them will be considered as valid possibilities for Christianity. The goal here is to understand each of these positions for its own sake, and to try to understand what value there may be in relating the Bible to evolutionary theory as genuine truth seekers. Now, I should be clear at this point that I'm not saying that evolutionary theory is right. In any case, it at least is not an article of faith. It would be a very terrible thing if one were to say, I believe in evolutionary theory, say in the same way that one would say, I believe in God. The two are not on the same level. My own thought is, however successful evolutionary theory seems to be at the moment, and however useful it appears to be right now, some later scientific theory will come along that will work better and will substantially revise many of the understandings that we have right now in evolutionary theory. And so I would not put too much credibility in it, but I want us to be able to understand the way that science works. So let's think for a minute about how the scientific enterprise works. Science is basically looking at natural objects and observing cause and effect. Now, in order to do this, every scientist has to have a model, some system of the way things work so that they can make sense of the data and so that they can try to experiment on certain things and find certain results. If there wasn't a big picture understanding of the data, if there wasn't a model, it would be impossible almost to do scientific experiments and look for things, because we're always looking for things that will confirm or deny the reality of the model. Now, we can think of this like theologians would use a model like Calvinism, for example. Calvinism, I believe, could never be proven. Calvinism is a model which is always useful to investigate the scriptural data, but the scriptural data itself could prove the model of Calvinism to be unuseful or to be very ineffective at describing the way the scripture works and describing what God is doing in the world. In fact, there's evidence for Calvinism, and there are some problematic passages that one must shape into their understanding of Calvinism if one is going to be a Calvinist. That's the way a theological model works, and it's very close to the way that a scientific model works. So, a scientist is always using a model, a big picture view of how the world works. And then that allows them to search for certain things, make judgments on what things are valuable to be researched, and it guides their focus on evidence. But notice, a model can never be proven. It's always possible, in fact, it almost always happens in science, that certain data seems to be in conflict with the model. And when that amount of data, which is in conflict with the model, becomes great enough, then the model is seen as being quite unuseful, and it becomes clear that a different kind of model is needed. This actually is very similar to the way that the discipline of theology works. Every theologian has to have some kind of a model. Here we use, once again, the model of Calvinism. Now, Calvinism can't ultimately be proven, but it gives us a shape in which to read the scriptures and make sense of the evidence. There will be certain passages, say passages where God changes his mind, or passages where God regrets what he does, that seem to challenge the Calvinistic model. And if those passages become determinative in one's reading, if the evidence there can't be dealt with in a different way, then the model of Calvinism will seem to many to be very useless, very unsuccessful. It doesn't help us much at describing God's sovereignty and God's action in the world. And so theologians must make judgments about which model is the best one in which to read the scriptural evidence. But the evidence itself can always challenge the model and could show it to be inadequate. That then is the way that I want you to understand the theory of evolution. It's not in itself provable. It's a model. The evidence coming out of it may help to confirm it, may show its usefulness, but the evidence coming out from it always could show itself to work against the model and show the ineffectiveness of the model. This is the criteria that we call falsifiability. Science works on this criteria of falsifiability. That is, it tests its claims, and if its claims are shown to be false, then that claim cannot hold up as true anymore. It's been falsified. And a whole model, if the data falsifies it enough, could be shown to be inadequate, and some other model will need to be used. So let me give a few implications then for our discussion that will follow. First of all, we can't prove the theory of evolution. It's only as good as the evidence for it. And so as long as the evidence seems to be in support of the model is useful. As soon as the evidence shows great flaws in the model, then the model may be unuseful. Certainly there is some evidence to suggest problems in the model, but at the same time it may be a very useful model in understanding many things about the way that the world works. So second then, at present, evolution seems to be the most useful scientific model in a number of ways. It shows the gradual development of life from less complex to more complex. That is a very useful model of the development of life. The Human Genome Project has been very successful in showing genetic codes and genetic development and tracing that all the way back. And this then seems to be evidence in favor of the evolutionary model. It seems to show with a great degree of usefulness. Our final conclusion, well, one would not want to believe in evolution in the same way one believes in God. I think one also doesn't want to dismiss evolutionary theory without considering it. If one were to do that, one simply couldn't be considered a truth seeker. Every Christian ought to be one who's interested in truth wherever it's found, because all truth is God's truth, and because truth can't contradict truth. And so all Christians ought to be truth seekers. If one were to dismiss a model that is at present so useful in describing a number of things, one simply couldn't be said to be a truth seeker. This is why, then, all four views are still on the table, and all four views need to be investigated in order to understand where the evidence lies, which of these views, as models, is the most useful in understanding the relationship between science and Christianity at the present time. The first position that we'll consider is the young Earth position. This is the view that the Earth is somewhere between 6,000 years old and 10,000 years old. The way that they get there is by claiming that a literal reading of the creation stories is essentially a scientific reading of the creation stories. The creation stories were intended to give us a scientific kind of an account of how God created the heavens and the earth, how creation developed on earth, and therefore we must read literally as if each day is a 24-hour day, and therefore all creation was completed in exactly 6 days. Now it also takes, this is important for the view as well, it takes the claim that Genesis 5, the genealogies there, giving us something of a historical report, and that this report doesn't have any major gaps in it, or if it does, that the gaps are not huge, and so the Earth would be somewhere between 6,000 years old and 10,000 years old. If we read the length of these length of life with each of these persons and we add them all up, this is the age of the Earth as far as we know it. And so the conclusion is the Earth must be very young. Now this view is certainly open to some criticism, and probably the greatest criticism is that it fails to consider evidence. In some cases, it simply makes a decision based on what it thinks must be the case without really considering the evidence around it. For example, why should we assume that the text must be a scientific or historical report in order to be a literal claim? After all, we know that there are some literal things that are not exactly scientific reports and are not historical reports. We might read a parable literally But that doesn't mean that the parable is intended to be a scientific report or a historical report. And so we must ask the question, why exactly must we say, in order for the text to be literal, that it's a scientific report or that it's a historical report? Certainly the earliest readers could not have and would not have understood it in quite that way, because their categories for history and science were somewhat different than ours. A second question is, well, why should we take this perspective without even considering scientific evidence? What if there's scientific evidence that's clearly observable, that seems quite clearly to contradict this perspective? According to Newman, the tendency he sees here is to forbid science to have any input on the how or when questions so far as origin is concerned. Why would we prohibit scientific observation and truth to have any input? Following Newman, let's trace some of the problems of a young Earth creationism. The first problem has to do with the distance of stars away from the Earth and the speed of light. Now, it's been calculated that Sirius is our nearest star. It's about 12 light years away. And it's also been calculated that the Andromeda Galaxy is about 2 million light years away. Now, if you think about it, that ought to cause a problem. You see, if the Earth was only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, then there would be no possibility that we would see a galaxy that was 2 million light years away. Well, of course, young Earth creationists are aware of these problems, and they've tried to give some answers. So, first possible answer is that maybe the distances are wrong. Maybe the universe is much, much smaller, and so what looks like 12 light years or looks like 2 million light years is actually a much closer distance. But there's a tremendous problem there. If that were the case, the stars would actually be very, very, very much smaller than they're calculated to be. And that would mean that the gravitational balance of the universe would be impossible, and the universe itself would have collapsed in on itself by now. The universe simply would no longer exist. As a result, most everyone has given up this possibility. A second approach has been suggested, and that is that maybe the speed of light was really fast in the beginning, at 10,000 years ago, and so it slowed down over time, giving it the calculation that it is right now. Maybe light was much, much faster in the beginning, and therefore we can see galaxies that look to be 2 million light years away, simply because the light traveled very quickly, and so they're only about 10,000 light years away, but light is slowing down. Well, that's an interesting theory. The problem is that if that were the case, mathematical formula that we use, E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times speed of light squared, would not allow for human beings or anything else to exist on Earth just a few years ago. You see, if the speed of light was much, much faster back some thousands of years ago, then the energy would have been much greater. The sun's energy would have been much stronger, for example, and in the time of Abraham, everyone would have been fried from the earth immediately, scorched and dead, and the whole earth would have been turned to a cinder based on the amount of energy that the sun would have produced at that time. This has led most to suggest a third possibility, and that is that God created these galaxies at very far distances, maybe 2 million light years away, but he stretched the light almost to Earth so that within 10,000 years, the light would be able to get to Earth. Now that's a creative theory. The question is, why would God try to deceive human beings in that way? Why would God stretch light almost all the way to Earth in order to allow human beings to see it as if it was 2 million light years away? You'd almost think God was setting up a temptation for human beings. So that theory doesn't look very plausible either. Let's turn our attention to a different problem then, the natural aging that we observe in the Earth and in the stars. Let's start with Earth. There are numerous rock formations that appear to have originated out of molten lava. Now, the problem is that these rock formations in their present state are very cold, and they're cold to a deep level. And scientists say there's no possibility that these could have cooled within 6 to 10,000 years. It would have required a much longer time period than that. And so to account for the temperature in which these molten rock formations are at the moment would have taken many more years. Let's look then at the larger scale, that of the aging of stars. We have calculations of how stars grow old, and we see stars that seem to be very old, and they seem to be ending their lifespan. But that would take billions of years. On this calculation, stars don't immediately burn out, and so the very ability to see them would require that the Earth and those stars have existed for millions and perhaps billions of years. We could look at our own planetary system. There are many instances in which meteors have hit the planets and have caused certain erosion based on their impact. But at the rate in which these meteors hit, it would have taken millions of years for this to occur in the present shape that we see it now. Or we could turn to the problem of fossils. Now, the problem here is, first of all, that we have too many fossils. In the typical young Earth account, the flood is given credit for laying all the layers of fossils. The claim then is that during that year of the flood, all of the fossil layers were set in that great cataclysmic event as the waters receded from the Earth. The problem, though, is that we have too many fossils. If all of those animals were alive and well on the Earth at the time of the flood, they would have been crawling in heaps. They would have been stacked on top of each other, many layers deep of animals. Much more likely it is that there was a much longer time period in which all of these fossil records developed. Or we could talk about the problem of there being too many layers. There are hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of layers of the fossil record that we find, or of sedimentation layers on Earth that we find. And it certainly appears that these are annual layers, that there was snowfall, there was recession of water, and that this laid a layer of sediment, and that this repeated over the course of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years. Or we could talk about the problem of continental drift. It's observable that land masses are moving apart from each other. And the question is, how? The young Earth creationists usually explain this in one of two ways. Either they would say that continental drift right after the flood was very fast, but then it began to slow down, or they would say that the continental drift all occurred in that one year. Of course, neither of these two perspectives have any evidence backing them up. There's not the slightest bit of data to suggest that that's the case. The only thing that is being attempted here is a way of making the obvious data that we have fit into a preconceived understanding of what the Bible is supposed to say. So as you can see, there's a great deal of scientific evidence that works very strongly against this first model. There might be reason, then, for one who's a genuine truth seeker to look for other possibilities. Let's turn then to the perspective of theistic evolution and see what that view says. Now, the position is certainly within the realm of Christian understandings of creation. It absolutely affirms everything that we've talked about the Christian doctrine of creation. Creation ex nihilo, that it's God who creates out of his sovereign will and for his own glory, that he is the source, support, and end of all things. All that is affirmed. But the theistic evolutionary perspective claims that these creation stories are not necessarily making a scientific claim. Instead, they're making more of a theological claim. What it's suggesting is that God is the primary cause of creation. That is, that God is the ultimate author of creation. He's the one who governs his creation. He's the one who leads it to its final end, absolutely. But that God creates by means of secondary causes. In his order of creation, he allows instrumental causes or secondary causes to work out the fullness of that creation. Let's think of it in terms of a builder building a house. This is our builder here, and you can see in his mind a picture of a house. That's the final cause or the end, the goal in which he's working toward. He has a picture in his mind of that house. Now, this builder then sets out to accomplish the building of the house. The builder could himself build the house, or the builder could use tools to build the house. What if, in this case, the builder invented a robot that was capable of house building? He programmed the robot to build a house exactly how he wanted the house built, and the robot then accomplished the building of the house exactly as the builder wanted that house to be built. We would still, of course, say that the builder was the builder. It was not the robot. The robot was the secondary cause of the house. It was an instrumental cause. It was not too much different than a hammer would be as a cause, or a saw would be as a cause. The efficient cause is still the builder. Now, switch that to the understanding of creation and God. God sees, intends, and guides and fulfills his plan for creation. But that doesn't rule out that God couldn't do that by means of an instrumental cause. That is, that God could intend all creation, but allow creation to create itself in a certain way, to reproduce and to develop and to grow and become more complex. And therefore, the process of evolution would be one that was fully intended by God, fully guided by God, and fully reaching God's intended end for the universe. There's nothing incompatible between that and the Christian understanding of creation. Let me give an example of this perspective using an official document from the Roman Catholic Church. This has become the official position of Roman Catholicism, and so let's just look at how they develop the argument. With respect to the evolution of conditions favorable to the emergence of life, the Catholic tradition affirms that as universal transcendent cause, God is the cause not only of existence, but also the cause of causes. God's action does not displace or supplant the activity of creaturely causes, but enables them to act according to their natures, and nonetheless to bring about the ends he intends. So God is guiding all creation. He does it by means of creation creating itself. God is the cause of causes, and he creates creation to create itself. Although there is scientific debate about the degree of purposeness or design operative and empirically observable in these developments, they have, in fact, favored the emergence and flourishing of life. That can be shown because we're here. The processes have worked in such a way that we are actually here. Catholic theologians, then, see it reasonable to claim support for the affirmation entailed by faith in divine creation and divine providence. That is, if we simply observe the way that things have gone in the world, it's very reasonable to believe that they are originated in God, are being guided by God, and will reach their full completion in God. And that itself is God's act of creation, but is a creation in which creation produces itself. That doesn't decrease from God's creative act, but it shows the means in which God's creative act occurs. Oh, we've talked about the first and the fourth perspectives then. Let's talk about the second and the third together as one position. We'll call this perspective the Old Earth creationism. And their argument is that the evidence simply is overwhelming, that the Earth must be more than 10,000 years old, a good deal more than 10,000 years old. But of course, this doesn't mean that God didn't create. And in fact, the creation stories may give us a general kind of an account of creation. We might be able to reconcile the data of the creation stories along with the data of scientific models as we understand them today. Now, once again, this position absolutely affirms everything about the Christian doctrine of creation. What it is questioning, though, is if the creation stories are intended to give us a precise scientific account or a precise historical account. Maybe it's a more general one, and maybe there's ways to reconcile the biblical data as having some scientific and historical evidence along with the scientific data and put them together. Now, this takes a number of different options, and William Lane Craig gives a useful set of options there. One of them is the gap theory. That is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. And then, these proponents would say, there's a long period of time between Genesis 1:2. And this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And then we see God's development. Another perspective is that of the intermittent day theory. That is, that God creates day 1, he waits for a while, allowing things to develop, then he moves in and creates day 2. Waits for things to develop, then creates day 3. Waits for things to develop, day 4, and all the way up to day 6, where the creation is completed in human beings. That, I believe, is the perspective of Newman, whose position you'll be following in this class. Framework hypothesis theory is also often used here, although that could be very easily used along with the theistic evolution perspective. That is, that there's a certain literary framework between these days. If you look carefully, you notice that days 1 and 4 are almost identical. Day 2 and 5 have some remarkable similarities. Day 3 and 6 look awfully similar. And so they would say, well, there's probably something else going on in this text that isn't trying to make a scientific account, but it's saying something about who God is. There are other perspectives here as well. The point is that the goal is to correlate biblical data with scientific evidence and find some way of putting these together. Let's pause here and review a couple of important points. First of all, I'm not saying that evolutionary theory is right. That would be a mistake in several ways. First of all, it's a scientific theory, and I'm not a scientist. I don't have the capability of determining whether it's right or wrong. There's others who are working within that field, and they're more capable than I am. Second thing, though, is that a scientific model, I believe, can never be shown to be absolutely right. A scientific model is only as good as the evidence for it. And when evidence against it rises up, it may show the model itself to be inadequate and to be unuseful and to need replacement with some other model. Will that happen with evolutionary theory? I have no idea. My guess is it probably will. Like most scientific models, it will probably be replaced. I would hate to put my faith in evolutionary theory like I put my faith in God, because it's a scientific model and it will probably be replaced by some new scientific model. So I'm not advocating belief in evolution. Second, though, I am saying that a Christian doctrine of creation could include dialogue with evolutionary theory. And to be a good truth seeker, one ought not simply eliminate the evidence before one considers the evidence. Christians are obligated, I believe, to assimilate truth wherever it's found, because all truth is God's truth, and truth can't contradict truth. And so, I've given 4 different models here. All of them, I believe, are genuine Christian possibilities for relating the Bible to evolution. All of them have benefits and have problems, no doubt. Certain ones do a better job of relating the theory of evolution to the Bible. Which one you end up choosing is not a big deal to me. What's important is that we understand that all of these are Christian models. All of them may be helpful in certain things, and that we shouldn't close our mind to the discussion before we've actually examined it. Openness to the truth is the sign of maturity in Christianity, and I believe that's an important thing in this doctrine of creation.